All right, so this video comes into play after the American Revolution. America's won their independence. They're now looking to set up their own government. They no longer have to worry about the British. And pretty much everybody thought they should be a republic, which is a government that the people elect their representatives. It's modeled after their democratic ideals of way back in the time in Athens and in Greece. And they modeled themselves after that democratic government. So not everybody was allowed to vote. People had different rules. You had to be a landowner sometimes a certain age, all sorts of stuff. In each state, rules were different for voting. And many states started to create their own government because they realized, hey, we're our own separate entity. But very quickly, we also realized that we needed a national government to kind of be an international voice for us. So the Continental Congress decided to create the Articles of Confederation, which is our first example of a national government in the new United States of America. The Articles of Confederation said we could do a number of things. You know, we could wage war, make peace, sign treaties, we handled our Indian or Native American affairs, and we issued money. All right, so that's the Articles of Confederation. Now what we got to realize is that obviously we don't have it anymore. So there are some good things, but there were a lot of bad things about it. And we eventually ended up drafting the Constitution. But let's take a look at the Articles of Confederation to figure out what it was. So it allowed each state one vote in Congress. No matter how big the state is, they got one vote in Congress, so everybody was equal. All right, and it left the most important powers to the states because they were afraid that if they didn't leave the important powers to the states, then we were setting ourselves up to be to be run by a tyrant again. If we elected or gave too much power to the national government, one person could get in charge, change it all, and we'd be right back where we were with Britain again, being ruled by a tyrant. We didn't want that, so we kept the powers with the states to protect the people of the nation. All right, the Articles of Confederation was ratified in 1781, which means it was approved by all states. So boom, you have our first government in the United States of America. Good stuff, bad stuff. Only really a couple good things come out of it. The one I want you to know is known as the Northwest Ordinance. Remember, there's a lot of land west of Appalachian States that nobody's really settled in yet. And so the Northwest Ordinance, as set up by the Articles of Confederation, laid out some rules for people living out there, gathering a say in the government, getting votes, and establishing states and all this stuff. So this is a great way to set up the rest of our country. And it worked really well for the Articles of Confederation. Now the bad stuff. All right, we were too weak to deal with most national issues. It was hard to have an international voice when our national government was so weak. All right, we were too weak to work with foreign countries because our weaker trade gave us a bigger debt. All the states were trying to trade, but in reality, foreign countries don't want to work with an individual state. They want to work with our country. They want to see what they can get the best out of. So we got a weaker trade and inability to work with foreign countries. And we also couldn't levy taxes, which means we couldn't raise money. All right, there was no way to tax the entire people in the nation or all the people in the nation, so we couldn't raise money to pay for things. So the national government was in a lot of debt. So after we realized, you know, hey, the Articles of Confederation, they aren't cutting it. We got to get a stronger national government. The states called for a constitutional convention. They met in Philadelphia, and those delegates that met there became known as the Founding Fathers. Now, not everybody who played a role in the American Revolution and getting our independence showed up to this. They weren't all backing it. Patrick Henry, for example, he was a die-hard patriot. He hated the British. He wanted independence, but he was known for saying, "I smell a rat," when he was talking about the Constitutional Convention, because he was afraid that too much power would be given to the national government. And as we had just worked so hard and won the biggest war ever to get away from tyrants and central control in the government. So he was scared to go, but a lot of people went, and there were some good things that came out of it, obviously. So some members that were there were pushing for this idea of popular sovereignty right here, which is a government in which the people rule. The people have a voice, they elect their representatives, all that stuff. So it's ruled by the people, and that's kind of where we went with the republic, the democratic ideals, and stuff we talked about on the first slide. Two plans were presented for our new national government that would eventually be drafted into the Constitution, either the Virginia plan or the New Jersey plan. Now the Virginia plan, it favored larger states. Virginia is the biggest state at the time. It's got the most people. So what they said is they want two houses with representation determined by state population. Lower house elected by the people, upper house elected by the lower house, and both of those houses would be the number of people you had in those houses from your state, depending on the size and population of your state itself. The executive branch, like the president, would be appointed by the Congress or the legislative branch. The judicial branch, all the judges and all that stuff, they'd be appointed by the legislature or the Congress as well. New Jersey plan, these are the small guys, the smaller states. All right, they wanted one house, one vote for each state, regardless of size. They wanted to make sure that everybody had an equal voice, despite how big you were. There's no reason why a small state in New Jersey should have a lesser voice in Congress because Virginia is just bigger. So they favored smaller states here. Executive branch, the president, appointed by legislative branch. the judicial branch appointed by the executive branch. So how do we decide? How did we get to where we are today? Well, you have this thing known as the compromise. Compromise, compromise, compromise. All right, the delegates really struggled to solve the issue of representation in Congress. How do we know how many delegates to vote in? How many do we send? You know, how do we make that fair? So the first compromise we have is the Great Compromise. And in order to satisfy smaller states, each state would have an equal number of states or equal number of votes in the Senate. So the Senate, everybody got the same number of votes. To satisfy larger states, population came into play in the House of Representatives. So the representation was determined in the House of Representatives by the state population. All right, so this appeased the bigger states like Virginia, and the Senate appeased the smaller states like New Jersey. Now the southern states came up and said, whoa, all right, we have a lot of people in our states that aren't necessarily considered a part of our government right now, but we would like for them to be counted. Obviously, we're talking about the slaves. All right, the South had captured and forced slavery on a ton of African Americans at this time. And so they came up with a 3/5 compromise. So essentially, you have two ways to look at it. 3/5 of the entire slave population in a southern state would count towards the total population in representation for the House of Representatives. So you can either talk about the total population and take 3/5 of those slaves and add that number to the total population, and boom, that's how you determine the House of Representatives. Or what they figured is that every one slave counted as 3/5 a person. I mean, you can imagine how many slaves each of these southern states had, and really how weird and corrupt this compromise was for the time in, but it did go into effect, and it was a way to appease the southern states. 3/5 of each state's population of the slaves would be counted in towards the total population to determine the representation in the House of Representatives and also for taxes. Okay, so we've got it all flushed out, all right? Everybody decides to ratify it on September 17th, 1787, and it's sent to the states to vote on it. Two groups formed throughout the nation at this time. You had two groups, one that opposed and one that supported the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists are people who opposed the Constitution. They were afraid that too much power was going to be given to that central government. Federalists are people who supported the Constitution. And like I said, Anti-Federalists felt the Constitution took too much power away from the states, and it did not guarantee all the freedoms and rights that people had earned in the American Revolution. So they were scared of it. They didn't like it. All right? The Federalists liked, though, how the power was shared, all right, between the states and national government. And their name comes from the idea of federalism, sharing the government, or sharing the power of the government between the central government and the states. So to make both sides happy, the delegates decided to add the Bill of Rights, all right, which guaranteed rights to the people. Now, the first 9 guarantee individual freedoms and individual rights that all the people in our nation have. The 10th basically said anything that we've forgotten is automatically a state power. So that protected the states and the people. So the Bill of Rights was a way to appease the Anti-Federalists. And eventually things moved forward and we drafted the Constitution. And that's where this video will end.